Hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining for this session, Access Ahead, a practical games accessibility crash course. My name is Arman Nobari, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of a studio called Good Trouble. And I'm really excited to dive in today. So let's see if in the year of 2025, I can get started with my screen share. We still have to ask if everyone can see the screen. My studio, Good Trouble, makes a platform called AbleToPlay. It's a games discovery platform for accessible games, and we have a lot of cool stuff to help studios as well. My goal is that when this session concludes, you walk away with some tangible, useful tips and workflow ideas to make more accessible games faster and better than ever before. So without further ado, let's get started. So what to expect from this session? This is intended for all audiences, accessibility experts and newcomers alike. If you're already an expert, then great. You probably know how hard it is to find really good examples to reference. My hope is that this provides something that you can take and use in your practice. If you're brand new to accessibility, also great. This is the crash course I wish that I had earlier in my career. Now, this isn't going to be hyper specific. I'm not going to be talking about how to make like accessible character controllers or how to do a specific part of a launch or a go-to-market in really accessible ways. This is more of a holistic approach, ensuring that everyone in a studio or everyone working with game studios has something tangible to take away. And at the end, I'll recap everything and share ways to get in touch if you have questions. So here's our agenda for today. First, we'll do a quick introduction. I'll set some foundational context about what games accessibility is. And then we'll discuss, game design, the philosophical starting points of making games, some core considerations at the early stages. Following that, we'll talk about inclusive development practices, followed by playtesting considerations. And finally, I'll wrap up with some super helpful resources to help you continue your journey. So let's start right at the very beginning, right at the introduction. Who am I? Why should you trust a single syllable that I have to say? My name is Arman Nobari. I've had a 15-year career building accessible products at places like YouTube, where I was on the community UX team. I'm the co-founder of an accessibility-focused game studio called Good Trouble. And prior to founding Good Trouble, I co-ran a product design agency also focused on accessibility. Because so much of my career was outside of the games industry, I try to bring a fresh perspective to solving challenging problems in games, specifically with regards to accessibility. And finally, I'm a cancer survivor that lives with a disability myself. I fought cancer earlier in life. I kicked its butt. We're all good. But surviving that experience really put a fire in me. Me and my friends in the hospital loved playing games together, but poor accessibility meant they couldn't jump in the same ways that I could. I would often find myself, turning the laptop and being the controller to kind of bridge that gap. And bridging gaps is really the first core theme to kind of ground yourself in this session. We're going to talk a lot about that. So, chemotherapy was really aggressive. I live with multiple disabilities, but I can't really complain because I love life and I love moments like this where I get to share really cool stuff with awesome people. Thank you again for joining for this session. I'll reference back to a lot of concepts and data. These are insights that we've kind of gleaned and uncovered as me and my team were building AbleToPlay, which is, like I said, it's a games discovery platform for gamers with disabilities. We help studios too. A lot of this information is pulled from the insights that we've kind of seen looking at global statistics, talking with our strategic partners and things like that. So let's start at the very beginning. What is games accessibility? That's how, at the core, we're going to start this. What the heck is it? What do I even mean by that? I describe it as the anticipation of the needs of players that bridges gaps of access to the content in your game. This means we're not talking about quote unquote like features in a settings menu. It's not about ticking some random set of boxes to say, okay, we've done X, Y, and Z, now we're accessible. What I really want to get us grounded on in this session at the very start is this is a holistic practice. So, okay, bridging gaps of access, I got it. Holistically, it's not just one single thing to do, but it's an integrated practice, got it. Why does accessibility matter? If those things are not good enough, if the I would say moral and ethical imperative to make things accessible is not enough. Why does it matter? Well, accessibility is a proven way to increase every measurable metric of success that we have in the games industry, from retention to sales to engagement. If you look deep enough across any measurable set of qualities that would indicate if a game is economically successful, viable, and contributes to the sustainability of a team or studio, accessibility is a proven way to increase those metrics. So if all the other arguments as to why this is important are not resonating, at the very least, it's really helpful and really important just for the games business. So let's talk examples. And these are very specific, non-exhaustive examples. If we were just doing a session on examples of every form of accessibility, we'd be here for about a week or two. And I don't think we have the necessary provisions on hand to just do that on a whim. These tangible examples are just sort of anchor points to help kind of develop that framing. Again, if you're an expert, you already know this stuff. Awesome. Take some screenshots. If you're really new to this, this is my hope, is to kind of frame this around, different ways to describe and talk about accessibility. So first, something really common, not quite ubiquitous, subtitles. Shown here in Another Crab's Treasure, shout out Aggro Crab. We've got speaker indicators. We see, oh, it's Krill who's speaking. We have backgrounds behind the subtitles, really easy to see, right? We've got some emotional cues with the portrait of Krill kind of changing as Krill talks. Subtitles are great for auditory accessibility. If you're deaf, hard of hearing, playing a game in a loud place, playing a game in a place where you have to be very quiet, subtitles, let's start there. Quest logs, also accessibility feature. It's big for cognitive accessibility. If your game has trackable and stackable objectives, you need a way for players to be able to review that information. Bonus points if you provide really richly detailed information about story context, location, steps to complete, rewards, all in one screen. It's not, air quotes, hand holding that someone just needs to get good and overcome. It's providing a well-rounded, really enjoyable experience for a game with a ton of content. If you want players forgetting about your content and not experiencing your game, that's a different story. Shout out Gearbox Software for the quest log in Tiny Tina's Wonderland. I thought it was pretty well done. I love the fact that there's so much to do in that game, and they have a really kind of consistent formula for explaining the quests. Let's talk remappable controls. Huge for mobility and cognitive accessibility, but it's bigger than just changing hotkeys. Remappable controls allow for alternative input devices to provide inputs beyond your design. So what makes remappable controls support great? A quick way to revert back to the defaults. So if you've been experimenting with controls and you realize, oh my gosh, I've done something terrible here, a quick way to revert back to the defaults is helpful. A way to show what has been modified if you're just kind of cherry picking things to change, that's great too. And just shout out to Free Lives and Devolver Digital for Angerfoot. I thought the remapping was pretty comprehensive for what an absolute kaleidoscope of a game that it was. The remapping was very grounded. But let's take the topic of controls even further. Yeah, if you have a lot of controls, having ways to rebind and remap them is really great. But it's even better if your game has elegantly simple and approachable controls and clear indicators of what those controls do on screen. That's also fantastic. Alba, A Wildlife Adventure, is really great at this. So shout out Us2 Games. I just thought it handled it, in such an appropriate way where you still have, the ability to, pull up a map and do these other things. And it was just boiled down into such a succinct kind of interaction package. But wait, these things, it just sounds like what makes for a high quality game. These things benefit everybody, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Accessibility benefits everybody. Every single person who plays your game benefits from accessibility, whether or not they identify as having a disability. Furthermore, accessibility is for everyone. The world is for changing, games are for playing. So if you need certain settings to fully enjoy a game, whether or not you identify as having a disability, that's valid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And everyone is such a big term. So let's not be like hand wavy about it. And this is kind of the spirit of the rest of this workshop. Let's get really specific. First and foremost, you see that rectangle at the bottom of the screen that says screenshot this to use later. This is the first slide of this type. Throughout this presentation, I'll have these indicators for particularly helpful slides or sections. Screenshot them and use them later. Screenshotting the entire deck is probably going to be, it's a whole folder. Let's be real, this is a 90-minute session. We got a lot of slides to go through. So I'll call this out on just the most important slides. So let's talk about this. There's no monolithic model of accessibility. What do I mean by that? There's no one size fits all, single definition. And, people can have such a wide range of needs that overlap. And this is why, I tend to really, as much as I can, avoid using disability-centric labels, because we're not trying to reduce players or people down to just some sort of diagnostic term. We're approaching this philosophically, person first, acknowledging that people have needs, and then we can remove obstacles and build bridges to serve those needs of our players. So it's not about, ticking a box. I have PTSD. I'll use this as, sort of the given example. I have partial paralysis. I'll use these as examples. There's not like partial paralysis box, do XYZ, PTSD box, do XYZ. It's that everyone, depending on what they've lived through, their own unique experience, their own perspective, and potentially the presence of disabilities, and just the overall lived experience of, living with a disability. All of these attributes and experiences can come down to needs. You might need certain things, you might not need certain things, even if you're talking with two people that on paper, in air quotes, have the same or similar disabilities. This also is not a niche topic. So this is part of the sort of grounding foundational aspect of this session. Facts and figures and stats can feel really arresting when someone says, accessibility, that's a kind of niche, right? Or what figures do you have to suggest it's not a niche problem, a niche topic, a niche, subject? So here's some stats. There are more people with disabilities in the world than teens or Gen X. This is just an empirical fact. Around 500 million gamers with disabilities exist in the world today. So there's more people with disabilities in the world than teens or Gen X. There's 500 million people in the world with disabilities who also play games. This isn't even scratching the surface of folks who don't consider themselves as, being disabled or having a temporary disability. For example, having a cast on your hand, you're living with a temporary disability. Are you a new parent and you have to really strictly control and be sensitive to the sound in your room to not wake a sleeping baby? Or maybe you're holding a baby all the time and you have one hand to, you try and pick up a controller, and that you have a temporary disability. These are valid. These are, a great example of how needs can change depending on context. And for a lot of folks, there's a hill to get over to consider yourself as having a disability. Disability is not a bad word. It's not like a scary slur or something. It's a very descriptive term that's okay to say. So this is why we focus on solving needs, not solving quote unquote named disabilities. By solving needs, you get at the root of what creates the gap of access. And ultimately, this looks like empathy when you put it into practice. It's okay to learn and grow. It's okay to get things wrong. Just be graceful about it. Don't be defensive about it. Be open to learning. I bring this up to just let everyone know, like, really earnestly committing to, going deep on this, learning this, and growing a skill set around this is the most important thing. But I'm going to end this slide on also a very important part for everyone that works in studios or works in larger companies that make games. Please listen to and hire people with disabilities. So recap for this first section. Accessibility bridges gaps of access between player needs and the content in a game. There's no monolithic model of accessibility. Accessibility is just quality. And we discuss accessibility with regard to specific needs, not trying to tick boxes relating to disability identities. And all these considerations affect around 500 million people and how they play games. So it's not this niche, sweep it under the rug type of topic. It's actually an incredibly impactful topic. So with that covered, let's get into game design. And we're going to kind of pull the process forward. Like I said, in the game design section, I'm going to talk about sort of the philosophy and kind of philosophic design considerations. And I'm a designer at heart, so excuse me if I get a little nerdy in this section. Let's just start with this simple individual statement. And this is a really important thing to start with. The most effective accessibility considerations start in the game design phase. If you design a game that is deeply inaccessible and then try to make it accessible later on, you're going to have a bad time. Consider it like atomic accessibility. We're talking the individual atoms that make up the molecules of a game. If your core design is relatively inaccessible, it will be much more difficult to improve the overall accessibility of the game later on. So in the design and planning stage, that's where some of the biggest wins can be found. At the atomic scale, there's two core fundamental concepts I'm going to kind of anchor this section on. First is information. This is things the game provides the player. And there's different modalities, different ways that the game provides that information to the player. And there's also actions. These are the things the player provides the game. And just like information, there's different modalities through which the player can do that. These columns don't exist in isolation, though. You know, this isn't a solid line between them on purpose. It's dotted, it's permeable. And that's because they're joined by an inextricable awareness that these two concepts, information that the game provides the player and actions the player provides the game, they are tied through gameplay. It's the point of games. Feel free to screenshot the slide. If, let me go back for anyone who just tried to screenshot that as I very quickly and swiftly said, hey, do this thing, and then I switched the slide. If your game relies on inaccessible means to convey information, you have an accessibility gap. Let's talk about that information gap first. So this is very, very initial introspection type of exercise that can help the concept of accessibility feel more tangible. And again, if you're an expert in games accessibility, awesome. I'm so happy you're here. I'm deeply flattered you're here. Maybe this is a useful kind of team exercise you can borrow. If you're brand new to accessibility, my hope is, you know, in the first couple sections, we were tilling the field. We've got seeds in the field. Hopefully this section can be the sunshine that helps sort of insights grow. So when you're designing your game's core concept, ask yourself questions frequently, such as, does this concept, and a concept could be a level, a feature, a mechanic, an interaction between other pairs of mechanics, features, or level kind of details. Ask questions such as, you know, does this concept require the player to see colors? Does this concept require the player to observe fast or jittery motion? And this is not going to be a comprehensive list. This is just to kind of get us started, right? So does this concept require the player to hear sound? Does this concept require the player to remember many things? So requiring the player to see color will statistically affect 1 in 12 men, as color blindness is incredibly common, like incredibly common. And that's, you know, kind of averaged across all the forms of color blindness. Requiring the player to observe fast or jittery motion will affect 1 in 3 people, which statistically is how many people are susceptible to motion sickness. Requiring the player to hear sound will affect the 1 in 5 people with some form of hearing loss. And requiring the player to remember many things all at once will affect the up to 20% of people that struggle remembering multi-step instructions. And one note on that last, you know, remembering many things. When we're designing a game, we are inundated in the lore, in the setting, in the task at hand, in the mission design, in the character controller, in the world. That's, where we have such a deep frame of reference, because we'll wake up every day and do this. We'll build this. The player doesn't have that. So when considering, oh, should we provide more information to help the player keep track of things? Usually the answer is yes. That would really help a lot of people enjoy this game, because they're not so inundated. It's not as easy as remembering things you have on top of your mind. So games with a lot of quests to juggle and no quest log, or many things to collect and no tracker of how many things you've collected, those really kind of introduce barriers to players. And how to bridge that is helping people not need to have so much working memory remembering things, but give them a place where the game kind of tracks that for them. So we covered information there. Let's talk actions. Actions are similarly considered. So inaccessible requirements mean that you have an accessibility gap in terms of the actions, the things that players provide the game. So when designing your game's core concept, ask questions such as, does this concept require the player to rapidly press buttons, provide inputs, to hold multiple combinations of inputs? This can mean something as small as using a joystick and pressing a button, or using a joystick and holding a trigger and tapping a button. I can think of like 7 games off the top of my head that has any number of these requirements to play. What about doing multiple actions at one time? Doing a hold to aim something and pressing another button to fire it, while also moving your character, while also aiming where you're looking. Does your concept require the player to speak? Such as multiplayer, competitive, and team-based games where coordination can mean the difference between winning and losing, having fun or having a really awful time. So let's recap this. If you require players to press multiple inputs really rapidly, that's going to affect the 1 in 8 people that have some form of a mobility disability or mobility limitation. Requiring players to hold combinations of inputs will affect the 1 in 5 people that face general muscular fatigue. A figure, by the way, which is rising every year. So if we do this talk next year, that might be 1 in 4. Requiring people to do more than 2 actions at a time will affect the 1 in 10 teens and adults that face dexterity challenges. And requiring players to speak will affect the 18 million adults in the US and 1 in 7 children who have difficulties with speech. So these considerations, once you start opening the lens of curiosity to see, how widespread are these considerations needed? How widespread are these lived experiences beyond what you personally have experienced in your life? It doesn't take much searching to kind of come to the conclusion that, oh my gosh, there's so many considerations that just aren't being made in many games. Sometimes those considerations are, made because the expertise isn't there. Sure, that's an information challenge. We can solve that. Sometimes it's for resources. There isn't enough time to build every accessibility feature or consideration you can think of. So let's get into that. So perfect is the enemy of good, but we can still strive for really high and inclusive benchmarks. Framed another way, designs are decisions. Game design decisions can include or exclude players, and no one's playing the blame game here. There's only so many resources, there's only so much time in a milestone. But you can strive for really, really good. And you should be realistic about the trade-offs you're making. It's okay to say we didn't have enough resources, but we earnestly tried to solve this problem. We earnestly cared. That's okay. Just aim for making the best possible game for as many players as possible with the resources, ingenuity, and focus you have. If you land between good and great, you're right on target. You can always strive for perfect. And I don't think anyone will fault you for it, but perfect is in many times, if you're existing within the realm of reality, limited resources will be a real factor. So I'm closing out the game design section with this. Please, here, steal this framework. This is a very basic evaluation framework that can serve as a starting point for asking those types of introspective questions. This is just the start. Every game studio, every game, every team will, of course, need to tailor this to what they're building, to their team's culture. If they are extremely adamant as a team, holding accessibility as sort of a blocker for any progress. Or if you're a team that's new to accessibility and you just want to get better and you should get better, but maybe you're taking some of your first steps, at least having a structural framework to kind of formulate and organize questions and curiosities and answers can help. So please take a screenshot of this, steal this framework, please use this framework. And then we're going to get into the next section, which is inclusive development. So we've got a toolbox of awareness, perhaps some caffeine in our system. Let's get building. But first, we have to unpack where not to start. And I bring this up because I would love to just jump headstrong into like, here's the best like 3 things to do. But like everything deeply ingrained in satisfying the needs and considerations of such a diverse pool of lived experiences, we have to really start with, where are we not starting? We're not starting in the final milestone before launch. That's where we're not starting. This is not meant to be a funny slide. I have done so many advisory calls where launch prep is the first time a team is considering accessibility. And look, it happens. No one can be at fault for not knowing what they don't know. But now everyone watching this knows, don't start considering accessibility in the final milestone before launch prep. And yes, late is better than never, sure. But you shouldn't start it so late for your own sake. It's not just bad form. It really makes life harder for the people doing the work. It also leads to much less effective considerations. Like we discussed in the last section, the best accessibility happens in the design phase. So as game systems grow, the surface area dramatically expands. And it can lead to a lot of bolted on features that take an inaccessible mechanic or gameplay segment and then try to apply, really accessible paint over the top of it to compensate as a spot fix. And those are not deeply well-rounded solutions. And a lot of these 11th hour fixes are really cursory, token checkboxes to say, oh, we have this. It doesn't affect the same, benefits of the game's quality or metrics as a deeply considered solution. So if you're checking boxes in the last, 3 weeks before a game launches to try and squeeze whatever features you can in, you're not going to get even the same outcome or benefits of doing that work. The earlier you consider accessibility, the easier it is to build. I call this conundrum access debt, like tech debt, but for accessibility. It accrues painful interest over the life of a project, making accessibility more complicated, expensive, and difficult to build. If you approach accessibility early on, even in small amounts, you are already well on your way to managing access debt. Also, just as an aside, I have not heard this term before. We might have just coined this term together during this session. So thank you for being a part of this wonderful milestone. Please use the term. Okay, so let's minimize access debt. Access debt sounds painful. Tech debt's bad enough. We don't want more forms of project debt. So how do we minimize it? All right, let's get really, really hands-on. The first and most impactful thing is just to track it. You can't measure what you don't know. So track accessibility topics like you would any other feature or gameplay mechanic bug. Harkening back to the framework I told you to steal, when you're asking these questions like, oh, does this mechanic or segment in our game require the player to see color? If the answer is yes, you should log an accessibility issue in however you're tracking your project to say, we have to fix this. We can't ship this game where people need to see color to pass this section. That's, a really, really shoddy plan. Like we need to have an accommodation there. Build it into your process to not call features done if it has poor accessibility. And I say poor because if it's inaccessible, like a very hyperbolic requirement, there's a lot of wiggle room. It can be accessible under a very narrow lens and be a really bad solution. So by saying poor accessibility, you're also acknowledging we don't want to just tick a box. We want to solve the problem effectively. If you want to be great, though, ensure the development of features, levels, new mechanics starts with an accessibility plan in place. Have those conversations, ask those questions, and log those answers early on. So if you're saying, oh, does this section or level or what have you require players to see color, you should proactively answer like, well, no, it won't have that requirement because that would create a gap of access. So how are we going to solve this thing we were originally going to do with color coding? How are we going to solve it a different way? Ask those questions early on and develop them into a plan. It's also useful to work accessibility directly into your milestones. So to be good, just review questions from the last section as you plan your work on milestones. It'll help develop an internal awareness about how you and your team work. It can help just in the planning process of making sure that everyone's kind of developing a vocabulary about accessibility. The more people on a team that can take partial ownership of the topic of accessibility, that means the more folks that can be proactive about ensuring the game or the project is accessible in the end. If you want to be great, just straight up do not close milestones until everything in the milestone has at least a scrappy V1 implementation or at least a placeholder to return to later. So this just ensures that there's a tangible work practice integrated into how a project gets developed specific to accessibility. At the very least, this will dramatically cut down on audit time and ensure there's a place in the code where maybe you're just debug logging, hey, we have to fix this, fix me. There's at least a place in the code where you can quickly find where a fix needs to be applied, which if you're trying to find individual lines of code where some accessibility considerations to be built after the game is built, good luck. That's where it becomes painful. That's why it becomes painful. Another tip is just retrospective reviews. A lot of times retrospectives or retros will get done for large feature work, for closing down milestones. But I haven't, outside of specialized accessibility teams, I haven't seen that many teams doing accessibility retros. And this helps kind of shift the conversation into a no blame zone where people on the team can just discuss what worked, what didn't, how are we going to improve, how are we going to make this easier for all of us next time. Do we need more time? Do we need more expertise? Are our tools good enough? It kind of just creates a place to talk about, hey, we have these really high accessibility benchmarks, but we're actually maybe struggling to hit them. Where's that struggle coming from? Make sure to talk about it as a team and reflect, because no one's going to get it right on the first try. If you want to be great, though, carve out a little more time during kind of an accessibility retrospective and actually play test whatever solutions or considerations you built. And this will help kind of prove to yourself, hey, our solutions are actually pretty good. Like this feels like something I can use. Are the subtitles easy and clear to read? In general, sure. In a screenshot, that's really easy to say yes. But with motion happening behind the screenshots, the need of really good subtitle backgrounds becomes a lot more apparent. Doing light incremental reviews as part of a retrospective process is how you catch those things. So you don't ship a game and then realize, oh my goodness, we have completely not made these subtitles legible. They might as well not be on the screen. You don't want that. I'm trying to help avoid that. But wait, retrospective reviews for indies and solo developers. How am I going to do a retrospective if it's just with myself? Well, you can have an introspective retrospective. So keep a retrospective journal in Notion or a document and just log how things are going. It can help you kind of keep in touch with yourself as someone developing their craft to, one, think about, is what I'm doing effective? That's sort of one of the biggest kind of learnings anyone tackling anything ambitious kind of needs to build into a practice is just checking in with yourself. Is this going well? Or am I brute forcing through hard stuff and not pumping the brakes to think about, is my approach maybe what's making this hard, or is it just, entirely hard? You can also, as a solo developer, rubber duck, which is a programmer term to just mean, explaining and talking through a problem vocally can help with problem solving, with accountability, and with kind of reflecting back on yourself. Saying something and hearing it in your own voice can really help, trigger new ideas. So just either rubber duck these ideas out loud or talk with a trusted friend to say, hey, I am working through the wildest thing on this game project, and I just need to externalize these challenges. Can I just talk at you for 5 minutes? It's an easy question to ask. If you're an indie team, try formal, and I know formal can be a scary word, but try formal weekly check-in meetings. Really get rigorous about it. I know life happens, I know everyone's busy, but put 30 minutes aside once a week where everyone openly and candidly shares how things are going. And as part of that, and bonus points if you're already doing that, but as part of that, bring up accessibility. Talk about accessibility. Talk about how you're considering opening up more access to more people, or the needs that you're thinking about. And I think a really helpful way to kind of spark conversation here is try and imagine some consideration or circumstance where someone would really struggle to play your game. Just as an exercise in empathy, just as an exercise in trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes and bring that to the table. Oh, I was thinking we have this, this shooting mechanic, or we have this driving mechanic. And, if someone has a limb difference, this is going to be really difficult to play. If someone can't use two hands, I don't think we have a solution of how to play this. So maybe we think about that. Just little introspectives that don't place blame on any one person or part of the project can really help and be an effective way to kind of drive that conversation. Okay, so we're rounding the corner of the halfway mark. We've got philosophy, we've got grounding, we've got a plan, we're building. What about play testing? Sorry, I have to address a big elephant in the room with this topic. I could not resist. I could not resist. There's a right way and a wrong way to ask for accessibility feedback. And we're gonna gently get through this section. Let's avoid tokenization. I'll unpack this gently because no one is brought into this world with this knowledge. Just like the world is for changing, our perspectives are for expanding. No one is going to be blamed or demonized or vilified for not knowing or thinking about or considering these topics. The important part is you're here today or whenever you're watching this, and you're open and earnestly curious about learning more. What is tokenization? It's the inclusion of people with disabilities in a superficial way. For example, caring about accessibility because you know it's important, rather than because you value including more people and learning from their lived experiences and expertise. And look, if you are making incredibly effective accessibility considerations in your game, opening up your game to hundreds of millions of more people with the most diverse set of needs imaginable, and you're struggling to really, understand lived experiences, there a case could be made that, how are you solving those things as well and in such a full way as you really could? Really valuing and understanding and being curious about the needs of people with needs other than what you're familiar with in your own lived experience is such an important factor here. So how do you avoid tokenization? You don't want to tokenize anyone. You don't want to, do the bad thing. How do you do the good thing? Involve people with disabilities throughout the entire development process. And as early as you consider or think to involve people, that's probably a great place to start. Don't let the first time you ask for accessibility feedback be the last milestone before launch. This isn't just, good form and good craft for making games. Think about, put yourself in the shoes of the person you're asking for help, for advice. Here's a developer that hasn't considered the potential validity of, my lived experience until the 11th hour. And now I'm being asked to provide essentially a cheat sheet to get out of this pickle. Like, that's not a good feeling. You don't want people cursory involved. You want folks really feeling like, wow, I have a seat at this table. I have a place in this conversation. Um, for hundreds of millions of people, accessibility is that essential unlock, that enabling layer to be able to enjoy, arguably the largest and most relevant art form the world has ever seen. So really, don't just tick the boxes, but really kind of see or aspire to see the value of incorporating a diverse set of viewpoints and lived experiences in your development process. So here's specific ways to avoid tokenization. For one, right off the bat, compensate fairly. Pay disabled playtesters at professional rates. Include disabled players early and often, not just at the tail end of production. Recognize individual expertise, but don't expect one single person with a disability to be like the arbiter or the spokesperson for all people with disabilities. Listen, act, take feedback seriously, implement changes. And finally on this slide, build relationships. Build that feedback loop. So the person on the other end of your playtest feels like they made a difference, that they're valued, that they're appreciated. Quite frankly, providing playtest advice is so critical. Anyone who is really serious about the craft of making games knows how critical feedback is. Accessibility feedback, because of how important and impactful accessibility is to games, way beyond the narrow lens of just helping folks with disabilities, but helping all players, that's gold. So don't, treat the folks that are providing that feedback in a cursory sense. Really create a feedback loop where people who are providing this expertise know how their expertise is being applied. But let's go even further. Let's take this further. Let's remove whole barriers to participating in playtesting. Think about the hardware you want to test on. If you want to test if an adaptive controller works for your game, great, buy one. Don't assume that every gamer with disabilities has every adaptive controller or ideal gaming setup. Cost is a frequent blocker for people attaining these devices. So either buy one and loan it out, ship it out for testing, make sure that the unboxing experience and how you've packaged it is accessible to kind of open, or understand if whoever you're testing with has someone that can help them set it up. That's a consideration that's okay to ask about. Just do so thoughtfully. Or better yet, as part of a multi-milestone testing plan, buy a necessary device if your tester doesn't already have one, and let them keep it. Let them, have that as part of the compensation for a multi-milestone testing plan. And don't just consider it some exact dollar value, like, oh, this controller is $300, so we're not going to pay you for like the first some odd sessions. Just include it as part of the overall compensation of providing, payment and compensation for playtesting. Furthermore, design an inclusive research process. Reassure people there's no wrong way to play, and that their perspectives are really genuinely valued. That there's not an issue if someone has a need that's unmet. There's a whole science behind wording and running effective research, but it all comes down to just making sure that people feel okay to authentically and sincerely and genuinely share how they're actually feeling about a topic, how they're actually going about, playing a game, what they really feel about a feature. If you tried to build something specific to accessibility and you missed the mark, You want to know that. You don't want that to come up in your reviews. You want to catch that far before then. So take the feedback with an open heart and trust that people are not trying to tear your project down. They're genuinely trying to help. When considering who you talk to, seek diverse viewpoints too. So this kind of goes back to one of the earlier points. Don't over-index on specific identities or needs. So I have PTSD, so I'm going to use this as a candid example. If you test your game with 100 people with PTSD and a single person who is blind, your playtesting is incredibly skewed. You do not have statistically sound representation of needs. You can't say, oh, we tested with 101 people with disabilities and here's what we found. If 100 of those 101 people have sort of a specific subset of needs or of very familiar needs. So how do you avoid that? You can't measure what you don't know. Ask politely playtesters to fill out a short survey about their needs. Keep it anonymous. Do not ask for disability identity. Only focus on needs. That slide from earlier that you should have stolen, the framework with the five different categories of accessibility needs, that's a good place to start. Do you have needs in any of the following categories of consideration? Visual, auditory, cognitive, mobility, mental health. No further information. Just start there. It's the smallest, best, I think, first step to just getting comfortable using these kind of terms as part of a process, and then measure. Just see like, oh, wow, we have tested with nobody with mobility needs. We should probably do that. And also, it's okay to ask for referrals at the end of a playtesting session. You're going to want to absolutely treat every playtester, whether they're a professional playtester or someone that someone knows, treat them with the same professionalism that you treat any playtester. And this means going back to all of the previous considerations, compensating fairly, including people and their opinions and their kind of solicitation for advice early and often, recognizing individual expertise, listen and acting, following up to build a relationship. Just because someone was referred to you doesn't make them any less of a playtester. It doesn't exempt them from the imperative of providing compensation. You treat all the playtesters with the utmost respect. So, with that in mind, a way that you can voice this, because sometimes developing the vocabulary to talk about disabilities and ask about disabilities is a challenge. Or maybe you feel nervous, you don't know the right words to say and you don't want to offend anybody. No problem. It's okay to just politely ask, hey, is there anyone that comes to mind that we should play test with? Is there anyone that you can think of that might like our game and that we should do a test with, or someone with needs that aren't usually met in games that we should do a playtesting session with? It's okay to ask that. And there's so much you can do also proactively as part of that. This might be fine if you have some folks that you're already playtesting with or already talking or working with. But where do you take that first step? So here's how to find playtesters with disabilities. These are not highly sanctioned shout outs here, but I'm talking in a more holistic sense. The first recommendation I have is just to partner with, become friends with, reach out to, have a discourse with disability focused organizations. Shout out to our friends at Makers Making Change and Neil Squire, Safe in Our World, Special Effects. This is a completely non-exhaustive list, but just for the sake of kind of anchoring on some core thematic references, there are amazing organizations out there working with and helping gamers with disabilities of all walks of life, of all ages, and these groups are incredible. I'm not suggesting you hit up Safe in Our World and say, hey, we got to play test this game in 3 weeks. That's cursory. That's so surface level. That's tokenized. Don't do that. But genuinely, reach out, develop a relationship, build a rapport. Talk with these organizations and see if there's something that you can work together with, and also recognize, the importance and the unlock that these organizations provide, and make sure that it's a two-way street, that you're not just taking resources in, but you're looking at ways to boost those organizations up, compensate those organizations for their time, for their resources, for their expertise. You can also work with dedicated researchers. Shout out to the incredible folks and our friends at Player Research. This is not sponsored, by the way. They're just incredible. Uh, they understand accessibility to such an incredible degree. They've even built their own custom accessible playtesting facilities from the ground up, which is mind-blowing. It's amazing. So shout out Player Research. There's other firms like Player Research too. Again, not sponsored, but just in terms of who I've personally seen, doing what I would consider best practice work. Makers Making Change, Safe in Our World, Special Effects, Player Research. Just incredible, incredible folks. I also encourage you to just join a community and make some friends who happen to live and play games with disabilities. There's a bunch of communities all over the internet. I'm not going to volunteer people swarm into communities I'm not a part of. I am going to completely and sincerely just invite anyone who wants to learn more about games accessibility or talk with gamers with a diverse set of needs. Feel free, join the AbleToPlay community. It's super helpful, super inclusive Discord. Scan the QR code, screenshot this for later. So we're rounding the corner. It has been 60 minutes so far. We're rounding the corner. Let's talk some resources. So the resources section is going to be similar to this. We're going to unpack just a few 4 total resources that are helpful. These are kind of great starting points that I wish I had earlier in my career. These are things that I think more people should know about. And I think that these are things that help a wide range of needs in sort of the games accessibility world. So the first resource I want to share, it just came out, I think like a month or two ago. Safe in Our World has an absolutely phenomenal workplace accessibility toolkit. It is packed with resources, links, tools, best practices regarding hiring, working, social accessibility. It's so good. It's a PDF that is page to page, cover to cover, filled with gold. Please take a screenshot of this, scan the QR code to get to it later. You can also access it by going to the Safe in Our World website or by searching Safe in Our World Workplace Accessibility Toolkit. It'll pop right up. It's available in a document form and a PDF, and it's free. So everyone should have this. The second resource I want to bring up is a program from Makers Making Change. Neil Squire is an incredible organization, and the Makers Making Change group within Neil Squire is taking on some of the most incredible work when it comes to, the sort of last mile of bridging gaps of access. And by last mile, that's sort of a logistics term. It's like, building something and putting it on a truck is the first 90% of a journey, but then that last 10%, that last bit of getting it into the hands of someone is really hard. Aside from helping gamers with disabilities directly with their game checkpoint centers across Canada, they bring their impact to the entire world through this huge library of 3D printable assistive peripherals. That's linked in this QR code. So overall, it's essentially a huge searchable library of assistive things that you can 3D print. Some of these things have to do with gaming. Some of these things have nothing to do with gaming, and they're just really helpful for people to live a full life, with more access. They have such a cool selection of very specific and well-designed controllers and controller setups. You can get the 3D printable files if you want to kind of print your own peripheral, but the Makers Making Change program also has a way for you to request the help of a maker. And these are folks that work with Makers Making Change to 3D print, produce, assemble, and ship these sort of adaptive peripherals in a really cost-effective way. So they're incredible, and it's so much work that they do. I also have to shout out Special Effect. Special Effect is an absolutely incredible charity that helps physically disabled people across the world have fun and feel included in games. I love Special Effect. I think that they do some incredible work. And I have to put a super big spotlight on their dev kit. So let's say you walk away from this talk. Great. I have all these ideas swirling around my head. I have, I have the philosophical framing. I'm going to be really inclusive. Okay, but maybe you're still struggling to build the things or know what a good example of something that's built, kind of how does it look like, work like in engine. The Special Effect Dev Kit has essentially starter resources for a lot of really, really common accessibility considerations, different types of play patterns, and it's free. So if you're starting a project, even if you're a really experienced development team, I think it's worth taking a look at, just see how it's structured, see how the examples work. And at the very least, it can help you go from 0 to 1 in the prototype phase really, really quickly. Having these resources on hand can also help kind of, if you do have that access debt building up, it's worth popping into the Special Effect Dev Kit site, which is accessible from that QR code, just to see, is there some starter resources or starter code that can help us? And last, I have to mention AbleToPlay. This is a resource that my team and I are building because we wished it would exist. We saw that this type of a platform didn't exist and would help a lot of people if it did, and it's free. So it's a website where gamers can find games kind of based on accessibility for free, and then for studios we provide really, really interesting tools to help understand and build and measure sort of the ROI of accessibility in new ways. This QR code just goes to our Discord. Feel free to email me and say hi if you have questions. But essentially, we want to kind of be that bridge for a lot of the most kind of intense long-term parts of building super accessible and inclusive games. We want to help enable that. So let's recap. We've been in this wonderful journey together for about 66 minutes, I believe. Let's run through some closing notes, and there should be enough time at the end if there's any Q&A. If you have questions in mind, feel free to drop them in chat. Otherwise, I'll leave my email at the end and you can ask questions at a most convenient time for you. So grounding out the recap with probably the most fundamental point to be made in this entire presentation: accessibility benefits everyone. It's just another way to say quality. An incredibly well-rounded, high-quality game inevitably will be making well-rounded, high-quality accessibility decisions. We want as many players to enjoy our works of art and appreciate our craft as possible, and accessibility is the way we ensure that. We want to ask introspective questions often. So the best starting point is often within. Ask questions about how you might play your game if your abilities were different. If you had a limb difference, if you were hard of hearing or deaf. Ask those questions. It's good and healthy to kind of try and put yourself in the shoes of other people and say, how might they appreciate this thing that I'm building, or how might they be able to engage in the thing that I'm building. Also, access debt, just like tech debt, needs to be monitored and fixed. Don't let it accrue. It charges really painful interest. It is so painful to go back and fix fundamentally inaccessible design decisions. For one, at the end of a pre-launch milestone or something, but also two, under the duress of crunch, you're not going to be making good design decisions about how to improve your game. So even if it feels cursory, just monitor these things. Monitor, do we have accessibility gap topics stacking up? Do we need to maybe do a sprint or a whole milestone just focused on eliminating this access debt? Future you will thank present you for making those choices, and your future players will also thank you for making those choices. And this is the last sort of main topic point. This is the last second to last slide. So the next slide is just, sayonara. But I end on this because if you do all of the things in this deck inauthentically, you will be doing it wrong. You will not be achieving the actual high mark of quality that you maybe convince yourself you are. Doing these things authentically means genuinely including gamers with disabilities in your journey of building games as part of how you consider your path to mastery of your craft. Don't just check a box. Don't do that. Don't just say I have these 6 things that I need to do. Really ground your efforts in a deep level of empathy and trying to connect and understand your players as part of honing your craft, as part of someone who makes games. Choose to do so for as wide a range of gamers as possible. And also, I challenge everyone to kind of think, is there considerations, that you could have patched in? Are there considerations you wish you started with? Thinking about, what are the things I wish that I could have done in previous projects is a great way to start future projects. So after all, the world is for changing, perspectives are for expanding, and games are for building and playing. So with that, thank you so much for joining for the session. Thank you so much for being a part of the session. And thank you so much for showing up and caring about games accessibility, whether you're an expert and this is more of a refresher, or if you're new to games accessibility and you've got, an open perspective about learning more. You showing up, that's the work. You caring about this and taking screenshots, that's the work. So thank you for showing up. If you need help with these topics, if you have questions with these topics, or if you are facing like studio level challenges with these topics, feel free just to reach out and say hi. I'm super happy to just help talk things through with folks and figure out ways if there's other things that I can help folks with. You can reach me at arman@abletoplay.com. You can also check out AbleToPlay. It's an incredible resource for gamers, but it's also a really, really useful tool for studios and for people who make games. And with that, I'll just hold just for a second to make sure no questions come in chat. And otherwise, I'm going to turn it back over to my wonderful friends at Games for Change.